we're going to start today with reptiles. And as you guys know, we're working our way through all the vertebrates. Got fish, did amphibians. Today we'll finish up with reptiles. And then we're left with birds and mammals. So before we move on, so reptiles, we're not going to get into too much detail about reptiles, but what are the big groups? Does anybody know? So what are the major groups? So we're kingdom animal, phylum chordate, class, reptile, order, and there's several orders of reptiles. Can you guess what some of them are? Fallon, what's one? Snakes is one. Lizards. Turtles. You could sort of put tortoises in there too. And there's one more. No, the crocodilians. Yeah, alligators, crocodiles. So those are the big groups of reptiles. And so in terms of adaptations and evolution, we have fish. We're the first vertebrates. Live their whole life in the water. Have to be in the water. Amphibians they have adaptation allowing them to spend some time on land and some time in the water. But all amphibians depend on the water, especially for reproduction. So all amphibians need to return back to the water in order to reproduce. Reptiles are the next step along animals that can live their entire lives on land and not have to go back into the water at some point. And so some of the adaptations that were needed to do that are what? Sydney, do you have an idea?
No, I have a question.
Yes.
Are sea turtles reptiles?
Yep. All turtles are, yes. So reptiles can live their entire lives on land. What are some things that are necessary in order to do that? Why can't a frog live its entire life on land?
And dry out.
They have very thin skin, which means they can dry out easily. Reptiles have an adaptation that helps prevent that. You know what it is? It's scales. Scales are waterproof. Scales are able to maintain all of the moisture inside of that reptile. They're not slimy. You know, people sometimes think, you know, if you hold a snake, it's slimy, but they're not. They're dry. Scales are very dry. And their job is to help prevent water loss. That's one important adaptation that reptiles have to be able to live on land. What's another thing? Why else do amphibians need the water? I think
Well, for their reproduction.
for reproduction. Those jelly-like massive eggs, if they were laid on land, what would happen to them? Yeah, they would just dry out very quickly. They need to return to water to release those eggs. So reptiles have an adaptation that allows them to reproduce on land. You know what that is? Not scales for reproduction. Has to do with the eggs, has to do with two things about their reproduction. First is fertilization. So what do we call the type of fertilization that amphibians have? External. Happens outside the body in the water. So what do you think it is for reptiles? Internal. They were the first vertebrates to have internal fertilization. So that means rather than the female releasing eggs outside of the body and the male fertilizing them outside of the body, reptiles have internal fertilization. So the eggs stay inside of the female's body, and then the male deposits sperm inside of the reproductive tract to fertilize those eggs inside of the body. Then those fertilized eggs can mature and develop, and then reptiles lay those eggs on land. So the eggs are fertilized inside of the female's body, but then those eggs are laid on land where they finish their development. They're in a what we call leathery shell. They're not like a hard, brittle shell like a chicken egg, like he maybe eat for breakfast this morning, but they're sort of this more flexible, tough, leathery shell. Sometimes you could find amphibian eggs like turtle eggs if you go hiking like around a pond or a wetland or something. In the springtime after turtles and stuff hatch, sometimes you find their eggs laying around the shells. If you ever pick them up, you could feel them. They're sort of papery or leathery. So these leathery shells are waterproof. And so they keep all the moisture within that egg so that the embryo inside can go through its development and then eventually it hatches. So that's an adaptation that's needed for life on land. Now there's a lot of variation here. There's some reptiles actually that eggs are fertilized inside, and then they keep the eggs inside of their body, and then they hatch inside of their body, break out of their shell, and then they're born. They come out of the mother after they hatch from the egg. So there's some differences as well. But overall, most reptiles lay eggs. Okay? And they lay them on land. Sitting?
Do the reptiles get their water from like their food or?
Yeah, usually. I mean, they can drink water as well, but they often get it from their food. All right. Those are some pictures of some reptile eggs. They don't. So again, with fish, they lay tens, hundreds of thousands of eggs were released. Amphibians, hundreds of eggs. With reptiles, it's 2, 3, 5, 10 maybe, but not nearly as many as fish or amphibians. Their body temperature. For reptiles, what is their body temperature?
Cold-blooded.
Samantha? Cold-blooded. They are also cold-blooded. And that means their body temperature changes with their environment. And so they can't regulate their body temperature internally. So we regulate our body temperature. If we get too cold, our body starts to shiver, and we warm ourselves up. Okay? If we get too hot, we start sweating, our body cools down. We have ways of monitoring and regulating our body temperature inside of our body. Reptiles don't do that. But they do have certain behaviors that they use that helps them keep the body temperature to the right spot. So after a cold night, the next day when the sun comes out, what do reptiles do? What do they do? They go into warm air. They go on a sidewalk, onto a rock, somewhere where they can absorb as much of the sun's rays as possible to bring their body temperature back up. In a really hot day, in the middle of the day, what do? Go in the shade, go in the water, go in a burrow. They move somewhere so that their body doesn't get too warm. So they have ways of regulating, but it's their behavior, it's not internal processes that do that. And as far as their circulation, they're similar to amphibians. Remember, amphibians had how many chambers in their heart? 3. And reptiles have 3-ish. Yeah, so how do they have 3.5? Well, if you look here at this heart diagram, we have a right atrium, a left atrium, and then the ventricle on the bottom like we had with amphibians. But then what you see here is there's a partial separation. It's not completely separated into 2 different chambers, but it almost is. That's why we say 3.5 chambered heart. What this means is that there's less mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Blood comes in, gets pumped out, and most of it goes up here. There's a little bit of mixing in here, but not as much as there was in amphibians. So we sort of say a 3.5 chambered heart. Yeah. Our heart is
Oh.
4 chambers. Our mammal hearts and birds, that wall is fully formed. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 chambers in the heart. And that keeps the blood that's rich in oxygen completely separate from blood that's poor in oxygen. And it's a much more efficient way of getting oxygen to all the cells and to the lungs. All right. Any questions about reptiles? Tomorrow we'll be looking at some reptiles and so forth.
Get a little baby out.